Hopefully you all can hear me all right now. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen in today. This is an interesting topic for me. As Bob told you, I'm an emergency department physician by trade and training, and I'm currently a board member of the NRTRC. That means that I use apps a lot in my daily job. I regularly use Hippocrates and Medscape and lots of other apps. I use apps to look at pregnancy calculators, and I use apps for all kinds of medical calculators to determine risk scores and things. While I'm in the emergency department, it's become a regular part of my armamentarium. I'd be a little lost without them at this point. And so that's a big focus for me. And I'm also an app developer. I've worked, as Bob told you, developing an award-winning app. And so this is a particular interest to me as an app developer, because the FDA has talked for 2 years about coming out with specific rules about how they'll regulate apps. And I was really happy to see that they finally came out with some rules. I would have been a little happier if I already had my app out on the App Store, but it's due out in a month or two. So this will give us a chance to really see how it works, because we'll actually be taking our app through this process. I had an opportunity also to speak with the fellow who actually wrote these guidelines. And here's some information about my background, and my email's on there if you need to contact me or are curious about anything when I'm done talking. Couple things. I thought I better put in a disclaimer, because although I've done, I think, a word on what they need to do for their app. It is complicated. If you really have questions, please contact the FDA, and I can tell you that that's not a difficult process. Having done it this morning, I spoke with the guy who wrote these guidelines, which are what we're going to talk about today. A guy named Bakul Patel is the FDA director for device guidance on things like mobile devices, and he wrote these guidelines and actually reviewed these slides with me this morning. So I can't do much better than that. Anyway, he's a great resource, as is the rest of the FDA, so feel free. This talk about why the FDA is regulating these apps, a quick history of their regulation in the past, not just about apps, but lots of other things. What are mobile medical apps, and are you a developer? What apps will they regulate? What apps won't they regulate? And some specific examples, and then six years, Apple opened the App Store. Nobody had ever heard of an app. Imagine you're the FDA, and by 2015, there's 500 million smartphone users worldwide, many of them here in the United States, that they're supposed to be 1.7 billion smartphone and tablet users having downloaded a mobile app.
Tom, now that's this is Bob. We're having a little problem with your audio. It seems to be dropping out fairly regularly. I don't know if it's your speaker or your microphone or what, but
All
Apologize for the interruptions and the problems. This is the first time we've had any issues with Adobe Connect, and we hope it's a temporary one. Tom, go ahead and let's see if this works better.
All right, I'm going to back up to the start of this slide. I hope you all can hear me okay. The FDA started overseeing drugs and other things back in 1906, so they've got about over a 100-year history of overseeing human and animal products, drugs, radiation-emitting products, cosmetics, and medical devices, which is how they're now choosing to look at apps. They're choosing to put it under the category of medical devices. And the rationale behind that is that if you go back to 1989, when they first started trying to regulate any sort of software, they had a draft policy that they later had to revise in 2005. They actually pulled it away and withdrew it because it just wasn't working for them. In 1996, in between those two events, they came up with something called the Good Manufacturing Practice and Quality Systems Regulation that is applied to all kinds of things that the FDA regulates. And what you see in the FDA regulation for apps is reflective of how they regulate lots of other things, including pharmaceuticals and other devices. And what they're trying to do in this statement that they've put out is to have some consistency in their regulation across a variety of not just software and apps, but across a variety of products that they're responsible for. So if you look at pharmaceuticals, for instance, they break them into classes depending on what their likelihood for abuse or danger for the public is. Antibiotics, for instance, are pretty low level. Narcotics and benzodiazepines are a higher level, and they break them down by those categories on a risk-based system. And they're doing something similar with apps, where Class 1 apps don't require pre-market authorization, whereas an app that controls, say, a medical device does require more regulation. And again, this is the document that I hope you'll refer to on down the road when you want to know more about this, because it is well written, and I've put it in here twice to make sure you see it and know that that's really what all this is based on, this entire discussion. So if you look at the wording within the guidance, and I don't like to read slides, but I'm going to this time because I think you need to hear this. This guidance represents the FDA's current thinking on the topic. It doesn't create or confer any rights for or on any person and does not operate to bind the FDA or the public. You can use an alternative approach if the approach satisfies the requirements of the applicable statutes and regulations. I want to focus on that last sentence for just a moment. There are already in place statutes and regulations that control medical devices. So things like EKG monitors, insulin pumps, all kinds of monitoring devices, those are already in place. And if your app happens to interact with those devices, it may be that there are already applicable statutes and regulations in place that you can use rather than this particular document for determining what your app needs to meet. Every page of this document contains the words that these are non-binding recommendations. And I think, again, this is the FDA's attempt to keep things fairly open and not have them too strict, because there is so much variability within this particular market, within the app development field, and it is so broad and evolving so quickly that to try to put stringent guidelines on it is very difficult. And so they've intentionally kept this fairly open. And lastly, these are recommendations and suggestions, not requirements. Now, you may still have to meet FDA clearance for your app, and we're going to talk about how that works. What makes an app a medical app? Well, it's partly based on design and partly on intended use. We all are familiar with apps by now. We all have downloaded apps. We use them all the time. An app that controls or is an accessory to a regulated medical device or transforms a medical platform into a regulated medical device is a mobile medical app. Depending on the perceived potential risk to the consumers, the mobile medical app may or may not require pre-market authorization and significant regulation. And again, it's broken into really 3 categories that we'll talk about. If you look at the whole field of health and wellness apps and medical apps, most of these, the vast majority of these are health and wellness apps that are for exercise or diet, and these are not regulated. There's another group of apps that are medical apps, but they pose a low enough risk to the public that the FDA has decided that they will do something called enforcement discretion. That's FDA speak for we're not going to regulate these particular apps. They don't require regulation, and I'll go through some specific examples of those later on in this talk. And then there's that smaller subset you see in the dark red. These are apps that are intended to be used as medical devices or control medical devices or transmit medical device information. If they were to not function as intended, they could pose a risk to public safety. For that reason, they're requiring a higher level of regulation for these apps. And the intent of the app is really important. What you say it's supposed to do is key. So if you develop an app and you start marketing it as a medical app, that it can do medical things, diagnose or treat a condition, cure, mitigate, treat or prevent a disease in man or animals, it's considered to be a medical application, a medical app. So how you choose to market it, how you promote it, is a key part of their interpretation of what it's of the regulation that it will be required. So a couple of other points. The FDA is not interested in regulating mobile device manufacturers or app distributors. App stores, Google's App Store, Apple's App Store, they don't want any part of that. The FCC or somebody already regulates the manufacturers. They don't want any part of that. The FDA oversight is really based on the functionality and what they perceive to be potential risk to the public if this thing doesn't work as promoted. Let me give you an example. Most of our mobile devices now have a light built into them. If you build an app that turns on the light on your iPhone, and that's all it does, and there's a lot of those that do that, that's not a medical app. If it turns on the light on your iPhone and that light is used to look in someone's ear using an attachment to the iPhone, if it's used to look at their retina using an attachment to the iPhone, if it's used to light up a mole and then analyze that mole for potential malignancy, it's a medical app. So there's a couple of other things you need to think about. It's not just apps, it's also any software system that provides users access to medical device function through a website subscription, software as a service, or similar means. I'm not quite sure how they're going to regulate all of that, and I think that what we're going to see is that there's going to be an evolution of the thinking around this document over time. It's, as I said before, it's left fairly open and somewhat gray intentionally, and I think that was wise. It allows some interpretation as things go forward. So we'll see how that plays out. But remember, when you're thinking about this, that it isn't just apps. It's also these medical device functions through websites, software as a service, or other means. So other things that are not considered medical app manufacturers, general IT, so if you support customer services, you have a cloud service, a data center, a wireless carrier, you are not considered an app developer, even though apps may run on your system. If you're an individual provider, if I had developed the Wound Map app just for me and I was using it in my wound clinic, I would not have to get clearance from the FDA. If I developed that same tool and I then take it out and promote it, sell it, make it available to other providers, then I am a medical manufacturer, and then I do fall under these regulations. So again, some of this comes down to intent and just planning. And this is a repeat. So, things that the FDA has chosen to regulate. If your app is an extension of one or more already regulated medical device, if it extends it, controls it, displays it, stores it, analyzes it, transmits the information that's patient-specific, and examples are things like I've got down here, EKG waveforms, and we've seen lots of telemetry things that are transmitted. Bluetooth technology now can transmit a lot of that information. PAC systems are the systems that we use for radiology data and CTs, ultrasounds, MRIs. There's an app that can be used to look at that stuff, and that falls into this same category. So if it's an extension of an existing device that's a medically managed device, a medical device, it's going to be considered a medical app. Apps that control a medical device, blow up a blood pressure cuff, even though that seems like a low-level thing, it's still a medical device that you're controlling. If it's an insulin pump, that's a much higher level of regulation, because if that thing misfires and gives someone too much insulin, you can imagine that that's going to cause problems, so that's going to have a higher level of regulation. We'll talk about those. If it acts as a secondary display without altering or manipulating the image, it's still a medical app, but it's probably going to be considered a Class 1. And as I talked about before, 3 classes of apps. Class 1, low-level stuff, probably is not going to require any pre-market submission, and what they call general controls that were first introduced in 1996, and these are referenced in their documentation, are going to be adequate. So again, we'll talk about some specific examples. Those things won't require much. If that secondary display alters, manipulates, or analyzes the data, though, suppose you're transmitting an image of a mole, back to that example, and the system analyzes the mole for likelihood of malignancy to look for melanoma or other skin cancers. Now it's going to have to require a higher level of regulation, and it'd probably be a Class 2 or a Class 3 app. Apps that perform specific analysis, and this was my previous example, if it looks at a mole and predicts melanoma, if it makes patient-specific diagnosis or treatment recommendations, so if it calculates insulin dose, for instance, based upon body weight or blood sugars, if it calculates radiation dose, for instance, based upon body habitus and location of the tumor and radiation spread, then these are going to require a higher level of regulation. Apps that transmit or transform that as a mobile device into a regulated medical device, we talked about that a little bit already. There's a good example in the AliveCore heart monitor. This is a little case that goes onto the iPad. It made a lot of, or onto the iPhone, that is, made a lot of splash in the last couple of years. It's manufactured by a company in San Diego. You just hold the device either in your hands or up to your chest, and it gives you a telemetry reading, cardiac output, and this would fall under a medical platform now, because it's transforming the iPhone into a device that can transmit your heart's electrical activity. So now that's a medical device. If it transforms it into a device by creating a similar tool, so if your insulin pump has a controller built into it and someone develops an app that overrides or now takes control of that insulin pump, because it's a previously regulated medical device, it'll be regulated again using this same system. Now, those are the ones the FDA has chosen to regulate. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the ones they're not going to regulate. These are the ones that fall under enforcement discretion based on low risk to patients. So you can read through these, but basically These are low-risk, patient-directed self-management or self-directed apps that help coach patients, organize information, tracking health records, reference tools for specific conditions, things like coma scales, Braden scales, whether or not those are used as reference tools or as clinical calculators. Those are considered Class 1. They don't need to have pre-authorization to be brought into the market, and they're not going to require a very high level of regulation. So here's some specific examples. If you have a psychiatric app, for instance, that improves or maintains coping skills, that will not be regulated. Mood Hacker is an example of that. You can look at on the internet. Go to the App Store and take a look. Things like pregnancy smoking, things like that, these are tools that just help monitor pregnancy. You can report where you're at and different stages. Smoking cessation, if it just encourages you to quit smoking, that's a low-level app. That's not going to be regulated. GPS apps used for asthma, for instance. So if someone has an asthma attack and they want to mark down where they had it to look for potential environmental triggers, really all this is a Find My iPhone with your allergens attached. So it's not going to be regulated heavily. Physical therapy apps. A good example is this PT Pal, an at-home physical therapy app. That's not going to be regulated. Drug interaction. These are not based on pharmaceutical apps or pharmaceutical drugs from your doctor's office. These are over-the-counter medicines and herbs. An example is the CVS OTC drug interaction checker. And here's some more preventative screening apps, symptom navigator apps, medication reminder apps, and asthma apps that control inhaler usage. Again, the whole focus is the difference between something that you would use for yourself to monitor your own health and is not likely to cause you any harm even if it malfunctions, versus something that's used for diagnosis and treatment and might potentially lead to bad outcomes if it wasn't functioning properly. And that's really the breakdown for these different types of apps. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to get your app approved, then there is a process in place, and the instructions are partially in that document that I referenced earlier, this document released from the FDA, the Guidance for Industry and Food and Drug Administration staff from September 25th, 2013. If you go to the FDA.gov site, you can look for something called a predicate product using their search engine. A predicate product is another app similar to yours that they've already looked at. So using the example of my wound care app, if there's an app that they've already screened, looked at, approved, that images wounds and transmits that information to a provider using measurements and scales and basic wound information, then I can use that predicate product as the basis for getting my product approved, and I can look at how it was regulated, and that should allow you to base your development and your application to the FDA based upon what they've already looked at, something similar. If you do need a pre-market submission, you need to anticipate that that's going to take 60 to 90 days from the time that you first put it into the marketplace, or into the FDA, that is, before you can put it into the marketplace. That they're saying their turnaround time they shoot for is less than 90 days. Lately, they've been getting it in about 60 days. So from the time that you want to bring your app into the market, anticipate that the FDA is going to require 60 to 90 days to review your app if it requires pre-market submission. And again, that's some Class 2 apps and any Class 3 app. Class 3 apps tend to be much more regulated, and these are things that most of us won't ever build. They're things that require more implantation or medication control or radiation control. And lastly, If you can't find a predicate product, you're going to have to go through the process of applying to the FDA through the entire approval process. That may take a little longer. Again, this whole system has evolved over the last few years. The FDA is still finding their way, I think, and this guidance that they've put out is as much to control the flow of apps that are coming to them as it is to control the apps that are actually placed into the marketplace. And that's what I have. And I kind of speeded up at the end there because I thought we were probably running behind. So if anybody has any questions, I'll take those now.
Yeah, we're fine on time, Tom. We've got plenty of time. If you have questions for Tom, go ahead and type them into the Q&A pod. And again, I want to apologize to everybody for the audio difficulties we had at the beginning. There was some kind of problem with our Adobe Connect server, and it was actually, we weren't losing any audio, it was just delaying it so long that it sounded like we were losing it. So if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A pod. We have recorded this session, so it will be available for review. Tom, we've got a question.
Okay. Okay, I'm looking for the question. Where am I supposed to see that at?
It's in the middle of the bottom. Libby asks if you can expand upon good telemedicine apps that offer patients self-management options.
Oh. For some reason, I'm not able to see that question. Let's see, good self-management options. Can you tell me exactly what you're more looking for, Libby? There's several good resources out there for patient education. I use WebMD, I use the Cleveland Clinic site, I use several. Was there something that you had more specific in mind? And again, unfortunately, I can't see her question.
Yeah, she's asking about self-management for diabetes monitoring and control. And then she also has an addendum to that. What's been your best experience using mobile medical apps?
Oh, wow. Best experience using mobile medical apps. Let me take that one first. I use Hippocrates and Medscape, and a really great one is UpToDate. So you may remember when I was a kid anyway, we had encyclopedias and all kinds of reference books that you would use for things. Well, just like there's Google for everything now, there's a site called UpToDate that has very recently updated information about every medical condition known to man. It's a paid-for service that most of the physicians I know use. It's a tremendous resource. It goes through all of the information you want to know about anything. Everything from, how to make the diagnosis to how to treat it to what to expect. There's patient information in there about how to educate the patients, and it's a tremendous resource. For pharmaceuticals, I really like Medscape and Hippocrates. Hippocrates recently came out with another one called Bugs and Drugs. I'm just starting to use that breaks down pharmaceutical antibiotics by antibiotic choice for specific pathogens. That's handy, and it actually, here's the cool part, it actually breaks down what we call the antibiogram, the antibiotic choice, not just by the bug, but by the likelihood that the bug will be resistant in the location where you're at. So they somehow collate resistance patterns from different parts of the country. So, for instance, the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus that we see here in Sheridan, Wyoming is sensitive to sulfodrugs and clindamycin. In Los Angeles, it might only be resistant, or might only be sensitive, that is, to daptomycin or streptomycin or clindamycin. In New York, it might be a completely different pattern. So there's some evolving, really, really useful stuff out there for specific types of therapies that's really useful. Back to your first question, I don't really have a favorite self-help diabetes management system. That's partly, I think, because I do all emergency medicine. And so I don't, unfortunately, spend most of my time trying to educate my diabetic patients on how to manage their diabetes better. Partly that's a fact of being on an EMR now, and it eats up most of my time. So that's kind of where things are at. If there's any other questions, as I said before, unfortunately, I can't see them because my Q&A box doesn't have anything at all in it.
Yeah, we've got another follow-up asking how long you've been using mobile apps, and do you have pointers for new users figuring out how to get involved with them?
Yeah, I've been using mobile apps. How long have I been doing this? Well, ever since I got a smartphone, and probably even before that when I was just on a tablet. Probably 5 or 6 years. I was kind of an early adopter. I think mobile apps are a lot like pharmaceuticals, actually, and I think they're going to be prescribed like pharmaceuticals in the future. I think that's happening already. And here's what I mean by that. If I go to the list of drugs I can use for hypertension, just for treating high blood pressure, there are hundreds and hundreds of drugs I can use to treat high blood pressure. Many of those overlap in terms of type of drug and side effects. But the reality is, and this is true for most physicians, most of us get used to using a handful of drugs that we know very well. We pick one or two from every category that we get used to using. We understand the side effect profile. We know the dosing. We choose them because they seem to work well and we're comfortable with them. When a new one comes out that's really great, we may change those a little bit. But most of the time we stick with our favorites. I think apps are going to be similar. I told you I really like a couple of apps. There are hundreds of apps I could use in my daily practice in emergency medicine. And there's new ones coming out all the time, just like there's new drugs. I think that the way that apps should be used is you go through and you look at, say, pharmaceutical apps. Well, there's a bunch of those. But find the one or two that you are most comfortable with using and that suit your needs, and then get really good at using those. I can use the drug apps that I have now to look through huge lists of drug interactions for 25 or 30 drugs at a time. That's an amazing resource for me because I do that all the time. I can use that app to determine whether or not if a patient has renal failure, if I have to adjust the dose of the drug I'm going to give them. That's a huge resource. That's very important. And I can do all those things with a single app. I've chosen that app because it works well for me, and that's what I use it for. And that's how I think you should start out using an app. Try a couple that you see recommended. There's lots of sites that'll walk you through what they think the best apps are. Pick a couple of those, try them out, find the one that fits best for you, and then get used to using it. And if a new one comes along that looks really great, give it a try. If it doesn't work for you, go back to your old one. Anything else?
Yeah, we have a couple more questions coming in. For rural areas like Alaska and Wyoming, for that matter, have you heard about anything about connectivity issues in using apps?
Well, I haven't. I'm a hospital-based physician, so we have Wi-Fi in my hospital. Most of the places I go have pretty good cell service. I haven't had any problems. So no, I haven't. And was there something else?
Yeah, Brian wants to know, let's see, it sounds like the point at which the FDA would require to approve an app is if it attempts to diagnose or recommend treatment. Would that be correct? And are there any other criteria that might put it under the FDA scrutiny?
Yeah, there are, and you need to really be careful about that. So if your app transmits an image, my understanding of it, like an image of a patient or a patient's mole or wound or whatever, or patient-specific data. So if you're transmitting information about a patient's whatever, even if it's just their blood pressure or whatever, and they're not doing it themselves, if it's not a self-management thing, I think the FDA is going to require some regulation. Now, that may not be very much. It might be a very low level of regulation, but I think here's what I'm going to do as an app developer going forward. I'm going to put everything into them for a while. And I think everybody else should too, until you get a really good feel for how it's going to be regulated. The website that they've got, I think, will walk you through. And again, look for a predicate app. Predicate means comes before, right? So an app that came before the one that you've developed that's similar should give you good guidance on whether or not your app is going to require more or less regulation. If it falls into class 1, then you don't need to do any pre-market submission stuff. You can just put it out there. You'll still need to notify the FDA that you've developed this app, and there's some sort of a registry that you go into. But that's pretty simple. The lower level class 2 apps likewise will not require very much. I think as your app does more and more, particularly as it interacts among providers and provides information about patient-specific information, that phrase came up a lot as I was reviewing this. If your app has patient-specific information, they're going to want to take a look at it. What else?
I don't see any coming in right now. We'll give a few more minutes if anybody has follow-up questions or wants to open up a whole new discussion.
Oh, I must have talked fast.
Yeah, you were going along pretty good, but not too.
Well, I said to myself, "Wow, we lost a lot of time there. I should speed up."
Yeah, we did lose some just fiddling around with the server, but even at that, it looks like we've got a pretty thorough and complete discussion at this level. So I don't see any more questions coming in. Tom, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us this afternoon. I will remind everybody that the webinar has been recorded. Invite everyone to see our next webinar. And Martha will be bringing a, one more question just came in, Tom.
Okay, what's that?
You gave a good example. If the patient enters information versus if the device gets the data, would there be a difference? In other words, if I put information in or if the device gathers it, does that have a different view from the FDA?
I think it comes down to what the intent of the app is supposed to do. Let me give you an example. If the app receives information about a patient's blood pressure, and that blood pressure information is entered either through a Bluetooth scale automatically or manually by the patient, then I would imagine that's going to be in it, and that's all it does. It just enters and records that information. It doesn't analyze it. It doesn't attempt to track trends. It doesn't make any recommendations about it. It just records information. And regardless of how it's entered, I don't think that that's going to change anything. If, on the other hand, the intent of the app is to guide therapy over time, to make a diagnosis of whether or not the patient has hypertension or not, to make any sort of adjustment or analyze the data or change therapy, then I think you're going to have a higher level of regulation. And I know what the intent from the FDA was, having talked to the guy who wrote the guidelines this morning, and that is to help control the flow of stuff coming to them. So this is a double-edged sword for the FDA, in my opinion. They've written guidelines that are loose enough to allow them plenty of wiggle room going forward. But because they're not black and white, they're going to have to spend a lot of time talking to people and going back and forth about whether or not to regulate this at one level or another. And I think over time, what will happen is there'll be some solidification between the different classes based on use and intent. But at first, man, I'm going to put everything in, and I think everybody else should too. And the FDA will just kind of have to put up with the fact that they're going to have maybe more apps put in at first than they will later. But their guidance does at least relieve a big part of the market from having to put any apps in at all. If you look through the stuff that they consider class 1 and the examples they give you, stuff that's for coaching and for lifestyle management and all those things, reminders and all that. I think it's pretty good.
We've got a follow up to that. If the person's blood pressure was high and the app then directed them to call a telehealth nurse who would recommend treatment, would that be fall under regulation umbrella?
Wow. I don't know. I'm going to guess no, because all you're doing is having an app recommend contacting a healthcare provider. That seems to me to fall under the same category as some of these others that I talked about, that basically just help the patient manage his own disease process. I don't think that would be one that would require heavily regulation. Now, keep in mind, I want to say this one more time. All of these apps, if they have any medical intent at all, are going to have to be at least registered with the FDA. You're going to have to at least go through the effort of going to the website, putting some information in, and putting some registry information about your app. You may not have to get pre-release authorization or certification. You may not require anything else. But all of these are going to require at least that you go to the FDA and let them know that you built this app and it's out in the marketplace, just so they can track these things.
Okay, and we've got, well, I'll make this into a two-part question, one part of which you'll probably be happy to hear. The first is, which apps do you use most in the ER? And the second half of that is, seeing as we've got a few minutes left here, can you expand on the Wound Map app?
You're just being nice now. Yeah. So my favorite apps for the emergency department, the things I use every day. I use a clinical calculator. I think it's called MedCalc. There's a bunch of those out there, though. And here's why I think they're really useful. If I have a patient who I'm suspicious of a pulmonary embolism, and that's a bad diagnosis, it's potentially fatal, it's hard to diagnose, the test for it is time-consuming. The best test for it involves a lot of radiation and dye. It's a big deal, and if you miss it, this is the diagnosis that kills more patients than any other of the things that we miss. So if somebody comes into the hospital and we miss the diagnosis and the patient dies, it's more likely a pulmonary embolism than anything else. It's up there with heart attack in terms of things we send home that people die from. So it's a big deal. So my point is, there's several clinical calculators, a Wells score, and several others you can use to help determine whether or not your patient needs to have more testing done for a pulmonary embolism. And when you're on the fence, those things can sometimes help you a little bit. So a medical calculator is a really useful tool. The other ones I talked about before are the pharmaceutical calculators. I use them all the time. Hippocrates and Medscape are excellent. They're great reference tools. They've been around quite a while now. They're well vetted. I can't remember the last time I saw anybody use a PDR. I think those are just paperweights or doorstops. I don't know why they send them out. Nobody's ever going to use those again. So those are two I use a lot. Up to date, I talked a little bit about before. That's a great reference. There's a bunch of pregnancy calculators that are really handy at the bedside, much faster and better than those old wheels we used to use. So those are great. You asked about the Wound Map. So the Wound Map is a tool we built over the last 2 years that allows us to image a wound at the bedside, quickly measure it, and it was designed because there's a pervasive problem with chronic wound management, and that is that these wounds get evaluated differently by different people in different locations, and because these wounds oftentimes persist for months, trying to determine whether or not they're really getting better, getting worse, is really difficult because all of the measurements are done differently by different people, and the way that they evaluate the wound in terms of its exudate and undermining and all of the different variables are done differently in different places. So we wanted to create a tool that would allow providers to standardize wound evaluation and treatment, and that's what we did. Our first version of the app is focused on pressure ulcers, Pressure ulcers are a huge problem, it turns out. There's about a $12 to $15 billion cost to the healthcare industry. They affect over 2 million Americans every year. 11% of the nursing home population at any given time has a pressure ulcer. So it's a big deal. So trying to get them consistently evaluated was important. So we built the wound map for that reason. We built it, we developed a beta version of it. We took it out into the marketplace far enough to have beta testers use it. We used their feedback to develop a better version of it that's faster and easier and more flexible by redesigning the user interface, and that's what we're doing right now. That new user interface hopefully will be built out in the next month. Then we'll have to apply for, in fact, I'll do it before then, for clearance from the FDA. So I'm going to be going through this process for my tool, my wound map, over the next couple of weeks. So if you want to know how this goes, you can ask me later.
To do that, Tom. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I will thank you for your time. And you know, you were saying you ran short, but we had plenty of time for a good Q&A session, and I think that's as educational as anything. So I want to thank you for sharing your time with us and sharing this information. Martha popped up a link to the survey for the webinar today. If you didn't see that, or if it went away, click on the link in the lower right pod, SurveyMonkey, and that will bring the survey up. You can then ask, or you can tell us what you thought of the presentation, and even more importantly, you can tell us what you'd like to see in the future. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We're going to call it a day, I believe. Tom, thanks again.
My pleasure. Sorry about the audio.
That's not your fault. That's Adobe's.
Okay, bye-bye.